for example.
Thanks, David. I always forget. Yeah, Claire was supposed to remind me as well.
Oh,
But,
sorry.
yeah. I won't pass the block. I'm sorry. We are now recording. So just for everybody's information as well, we are recording. So just to be aware of that, because we do welcome any questions as you go. Towards the end, you're welcome to come on the mic if you would like to, but just bear in mind that we are being recorded, and please post any questions in the chat and I can ask them for you. Sorry, Claire, carry on.
Thank you, Nick. So yeah, our publications policy came into effect in 2014, so 10 years ago, and it was dated in 2015 and 2023 in response to the UKRI and Wellcome and our other funders updating their policies. And when we updated it to take effect from the 1st of January 2023, we implemented rights retention and credit and looking at data statements. And that was done in conjunction with the N8 universities, so the 8 research-intensive universities in the north of England. So yeah, hopefully we've got some of our N8 colleagues here. Our publication policy applies to our peer-reviewed research outputs and states a commitment to make them freely accessible. And it also is optional for other outputs, for example, chapters and monographs, which we'll be discussing today. We launched an open research statement in late 2022, and that's very much part of the research culture initiatives led by our Dean of Research Culture, Kat Davis. And that's part, that sort of links at the bottom is part of our research culture, and open research and impact is one of those 5 links in that. So huge thanks to Kat and everybody on the research culture team. There's been key policy changes from our funders, particularly UKRI, Wellcome and others, about full and immediate open access. So as soon as things are published, they should be made available. And there's lots of different routes for that. And then we're seeing a new focus on monographs from UKRI that came into effect from the 1st of January this year. Please do get in contact with the library if you're UKRI funded and have a monograph. And we have seen the draft open access policy for the next REF 2029, which has been going through consultation. And huge thanks to our colleagues in the Research and Innovation Service and Lizzie Garcher in particular, who's been leading on that, and my colleagues in the library who have been helping with that response. We're all waiting to see what comes through in the REF policy, hopefully late this year, but maybe early 2025. Can you press next, please, Nick? So yeah, the UKRI open access policy applies to all publications which acknowledge UKRI funding, and that's UKRI and all of the 9 councils within it, to ensure that findings from publicly funded research can be freely accessed, used and built upon. And it applies to peer-reviewed research articles from the 1st of January 2022, and monographs, book chapters and edit editions from the 1st of January this year. And yeah, for those of you who are publishing monographs and journals, there's a different way of doing things. So we get a block grant for journal articles and conference proceedings, and then we manage those within the library. And it's a different way of funding for the long form publications, where the money is held by UKRI, but the library makes that submission on your behalf. So there's lots about that on the library website. And if you don't know what to do, please do submit an email, submit an inquiry, and the team will pick that up and guide you on how to go about publishing open access if you are UKRI funded. Next slide, Nick. So there's different challenges with open access monographs to journals. Obviously, we've been doing open access for journals for a long time. And if you look at the rates of how much we make open in the UK, very much supported by our funders and the policies, we are really high up there. There's league tables for that, league tables for everything, aren't there? But it's a different challenge with the books, one because of the book processing charges and how much they are, and they is capped for UKRI. So if you are UKRI funded, it's capped at £10,000, including VAT, and 1,000 for book chapters, including VAT, and then there's a limit for Diamond as well. The infrastructure to support open access monographs is different. Monographs, as we all know, they're a lot longer. There's lots of things that go in. It's different to a one journal article that you want to put up. So I know the team who look after the repositories have been looking at that. Because of the funding model, it can reinforce gaps depending on what funding is available to support the BPCs. And we all, yes, what's going to happen for those who aren't funded by UKRI and independent scholars? And that's where I think on the next slide, we've got a bit more about support for that here at Leeds. And it can vary across the disciplines, and that's also within the output types. Open access in journals has been a work in progress for many, many years, and this is us sort of moving towards more in the monographs, which we've been doing for a while, and I'm sure our speakers will tell you more about how they've been involved. Nick. So yeah, more about long form. So there are different routes to publish, as there always are, and we love to give them labels, don't we? So gold is where you pay to publish, and instead of the article processing charge, the APC, we talk about the BPC, the book processing charges. There are university presses, and some of them have pay to publish model, some of them are diamonds, some of them enable you to put certain parts of your publication in a repository. It's a mixed model, and we know that that can be very complex. So we're here to help if you've got any questions on that. At the University of Leeds, we support different models, particularly the diamond, which we'll hear about today, some of that through our subscriptions, and also the White Rose University Press, which is a joint endeavour for an open access press between York University, Sheffield University and the University of Leeds. And the library has funding to help fee waivers for Leeds authors who are publishing with White Rose University Press. There's more about that on the library website and on the White Rose website. So if you are publishing and interested in White Rose, there are fee waivers available. Some publishers allow you to go green, which means putting a copy, potentially the author accepted manuscript, in the repository, but that might be limited to just one chapter and it has embargoes, etc. Or there's the diamond model, which is more of a sort of membership model, where you pay, and that enables, there's no author-facing fees. It's very much sort of a consortium model, and Leeds supports Bloomsbury Open along that model. So next slide, Nick. So yeah, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and Nick will pick them up at the end. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers and pass over to them.
So hopefully you can share, David. I've got stop my share. Can you find the button?
You okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, David. David, you're muted.
Muted.
I muted myself. I don't know how I did that. So thanks, Nick, Claire, and Ros, for this session. Thanks to you all for being there. I'm a philosopher of science based in Madrid, although connected to the UK through the British Society for Philosophy of Science. And my role in this talk is to explain to you what our publication, or our diamond publication model for books is. At first, I had prepared a very theoretical talk, but then I saw Claire and Ros talks yesterday, and then I thought I can't do that. So I'm cutting down my talk to 2 slides and some history. So who we are? Let me just that slide I will still use. So I'm representing here the British Society for Philosophy of Science, which is a small society, although a relatively well-off society, because we have a very successful journal, the British Journal for Philosophy of Science, now with Chicago, that provides royalties. And this society has partnered with Calgary University Press in Canada to launch an open access diamond book collection in which neither authors nor readers pay to publish or read. And it has all been subsidized by grants so far. Our first book came out last year, and we have a 5-year contract in which we are expecting to publish by the end of it at least 4 other books. So it's quite a small, minimal operating model. That's our first book. And that's where my informal talk begins, because the first question you might ask is why we were doing this. I mean, why a society takes this initiative instead of partnering with commercial publishers or libraries? Well, at first, we started working on this in 2017-18, and at first we thought we could replicate the success of our journal selling it to publishers. What we thought is, can we persuade commercial publishers to pay a Diamond open access book collection if we give them the privilege to publish our journal, which is a sort of desired journal in our field? The answer was no. No, for two reasons. First, because publishers, and I'm talking here Cambridge, Oxford, Chicago, that sort of publishers, were already anticipating changes in the journal world, the evolution to the gold open access regime in which we are currently are. So they weren't willing to give us the privilege of publishing a Diamond open access book collection at the expense of the journal, because they thought that that not might be beneficial for them. And also the society realized that they were taking a risk if they put the finances, if they made the finances depend on the journal and the book collection. With the journal, they were well off, but if they had to subsidize with the journal these books, they could have an impact on the other activities. So we sought instead a non-commercial partner. This is Calgary University Press. Calgary is, like Leeds, committed to open access, ideological in part, because they have some leaders in the repository, in the open access repository world. And they thought that they could fund this pilot experiment of our book series with grants, at least for 5 years. But then we discovered that giving the authors the chance to publish for free with us was not exactly enticing for many, because Calgary is fine, they are generous, they do very good editorial work, but they are not Cambridge, they are not Oxford. So if you as an author you have a manuscript and you need to trust your manuscript to a publisher, if you read BSPS Open, you're not going to think of the British Society of Philosophy of Science, which is prestigious. You're going to think of a publisher you have never heard of in philosophy, which is our field. That put off many of our potential authors, and that has put a burden on us, the editors of the collection, because suddenly we need to start caring about acquisitions. We need to start trying to reach out to authors and get their manuscript for us. This is something that our colleagues in more conventional book series don't have to do. The manuscripts come to the publisher, and the publisher contacts the editor for a review, and there is the only thing they have to do. Well, if you go independent and you try to create a Diamond pure open access model with an independent publisher, you need to, as an academic, to start doing acquisition work, and that's hard. Moreover, the journal, the book series is for 5 years, and after these 5 years, we need to find additional source of funding. And these additional sources of funding will come from the society and from grants. As editors of the collection, we are actively looking for it, and that's an additional burden. Lots of work for all our colleagues in the steering committee. So why are we doing it? So why are we undertaking all this work that we could easily do away without? Well, there are two reasons here. The first reason is that as a society, the British Society for Philosophy of Science wants to reclaim the intellectual independence. In an ideal world, it is the society and not the publisher what should count as the source of prestige on any title in our series. Scholarly societies have sold themselves so much to publishers that in the end, they have built up the prestige of the publisher as an independent entity, whereas we think, the prestige of any publication should come from the academics working behind it. So the British Society for Philosophy of Science wants to reclaim its epistemic authority in deciding which books are good, independently of which publisher we publish the book with. And the second reason, and this relates to what Claire was already saying, is that we are very aware that as a society, we do have a very diverse constituency. Some of our members are rich and work at very wealthy universities. Some are not. And we think that it's a mission, it's part of the mission of the society to give all its members and the members in our broader community a chance to publish open access for free. That is a matter of what we in philosophy call epistemic justice. The third reason why we're doing it, and this is my last reason, is that as you're gonna see in the next presentation, consortia, library consortia, might create like umbrella solutions in which all academics might coexist and try to publish together. But smaller fields like philosophy are usually not a priority in this consortium. So we get very little attention and very little visibility in the final output. So we thought that as a society, we need to establish our autonomy, trying to create a book collection in which we could exist intellectually as a niche independently of the consortium. So these are the three reasons why we are undertaking all this world of making this collection work. And I could have told you this with slides and a more philosophical orientation, but I hope this is enough for now. I want to be short and I want to get to the Q&A. So Ros, if you want to go next.
Okay, thanks, David. Let me share my screen. Just arranging things on a very small laptop screen. Let me just get this set up. Okay. So, I'm Ros. I head up open access at Bloomsbury. We're an independent publisher headquartered in London, and I'm going to talk about Bloomsbury Open Collections, which is a collective action OA model for monographs. So essentially, we're trying to provide a route for at least some of our books to publish open access at no cost to the authors through a library funding model. Participating libraries get extra benefits just for them. And because we can't extend this to all of our authors at this point, we're prioritizing authors who we think are least likely to be able to raise funds for OA fees. So I'm going to tell you about the pilot that we ran on our African Studies and International Development books and what we learned from it. I'll tell you about what we're doing now, which is year 2, and then I'll end with some reflections on making models like this work and how we might be able to extend them to more books. So just to start, what's an academic book publisher for, and thinking about our role as communicators of the best in new thought and ideas, and thinking about open access as being fundamentally one of the best routes to do that. I also want to mention that Bloomsbury's an arts, humanities, and social science publisher. We don't publish any journals, and we don't publish anything in STEM subjects. So when we're coming at thinking about what we're for and the role that open access plays and how we do open access, we're coming at it very much from that perspective, from the perspectives of disciplines for which monographs remain a really important output. And I do worry that those disciplines have not been given enough prominence in our research cultures in general, certainly from the point of view of sort of funders and governments, but also from the perspective of open access. And so just to look at, here are some of the open access books that we've published. What's the, how is artificial intelligence and digital disinformation affecting our societies? How can we best educate the rising university generations? What's happening to human rights internationally? I think navigating a huge number of our challenges is really reliant on the humanities and social sciences, which is not to suggest that any research which is not sort of outwardly focusing in this is less valuable, but just to make that case from a societal point of view for the need for wider access to this research. And why open access? So this is from a study which compared open access with non-open access books and looked at the effect on downloads and citations, and found that open access books were downloaded 10 times more than equivalent non-open access books, cited 2.5 times more. And that usage was very much more geographically distributed. So you can see much higher usage in the global south for open access books. So I guess some evidence that open access is making good on those promises to really widen out readership, democratize access to knowledge. But at Bloomsbury, we don't publish all of our books open access. And until recently, if authors wanted to publish open access with us, their only route for the most part was to pay a fee. Our fee is £8,000. That's actually less than many equivalent publishers, but it's still an awful lot, and it's out of reach for many arts, humanities, and social science scholars who don't have direct grants. And in fact, those who were managing to publish open access were almost exclusively at either they had big grants or they were based at rich universities, almost in the North America and in Europe. And that's very much not equitable. It's just not serving the communities that we are publishing for. And that led us to rethink a little bit. And I'm going to pivot a little bit here and tell you about Z Books, which is an imprint published by Bloomsbury, which is a leading source of critical, decolonial, and anti-colonial approaches to social sciences research. So it's mostly publishing in African studies, international development, development economics, and gender studies. And it seeks to foreground and promote research on and from the Global South. So we have a lot of authors from the Global South and a lot of North-South collaborations within these books. And that's certainly a key aim within this imprint. And for those authors, open access has long been something that they have particularly wanted, because they want to make sure that the authors in the countries that are the academics in the subject countries that are the subject of this research are able to access it. And that wasn't something that we've previously been able to provide unless they had independent funding. And so we did actually start with the idea of how could we make all of our African studies monographs available open access? And that brings me to Bloomsbury Open Collections. So we've described this variously as a collective action or subscribe to open type open access model for scholarly books. So there are no author fees, and the aim is to make the books OA immediately on publication. And we piloted this last year with 20 frontlist titles in African studies and international development. So essentially we said we want to make these 20 titles available open access, and we're going to seek to raise funds for that from libraries that might otherwise have purchased these books, libraries where there is a strong research program in this area, there's an interest in these titles. So instead of buying them, would you consider contributing to a project which aims to support open access? And for those libraries that did participate, we guaranteed that if we didn't raise enough funds to make all of the books OA, they would be guaranteed permanent access to all the top 20 titles. And just in case we did make all of the books open access, just to make sure that those libraries still retained some benefits just for them, the libraries would also receive 1 year's access to almost 200 related backlist titles. So to talk through some of these decisions, why 20 titles? I think we wanted to do something that felt like a meaningful intervention. We publish about 1,200 monographs a year, so going title by title felt very small to us, I guess, but also to keep it small enough that we could have a real subject coherence and keep the fees for individual libraries to participate low and manageable. Why only 1 year's access to those backlist titles? That's the subscription element. So the idea is if you want to retain access to that backlist, then you need to participate year after year, and then it can stay in your library catalogue and everyone will retain access. But even if you're less into the backlist titles, you still get the frontlist benefit. I don't know, there are different ways of doing these models. This was us trying to make some decisions about what might work for us. So as I said, we launched this last year. So we were seeking to raise funds last year for books that are publishing this year. What was the outcome of that? We achieved pretty much 50% exactly of our funding target. So as a result, we're making 10 books available OA at no cost to the authors. I'd mentioned the Global South focus of those lists as being a particular reason why we focused on those. So there are 58 authors in some way involved in those 10 books, either as full authors or as contributors to an edited collection, and 17 are based in the Global South. So you can see that we are benefiting Global South authors, but actually there are an awful lot of authors based elsewhere that are also benefiting. And it was a criterion that the authors must not have any other funding source. So if you had, I don't know, if your book was funded by the Wellcome Trust, then we would expect you to go to the Wellcome Trust for funding. This was for authors who could not source open access funding elsewhere. So yeah, was this a success? Clearly, we didn't reach our full target. But on the other hand, we are making these 10 books open access that otherwise would have been behind a paywall. And we think that there's a lot of merit in this. So it's something that we want to stick with and see if we can try and make it work a bit better. So let me tell you a little bit about what we learned. So authors were very keen on it. We heard a lot from them. They'd wanted to publish OA, but hadn't been able to find another route. We definitely felt that open access would support visibility, impact, and reach for their work. They definitely wanted academia to be more inclusive and accessible and saw open access as part of that. And they also saw open access as really crucial for catalyzing dialogues between Global North and Global South. What about institutions? What did they tell us, and who participated? So we certainly heard that the focus on equity, the focus on North-South collaboration was something that many of the institutions that participated felt was important to them. So Boaz at Lehigh University told us that support for scholarship produced by diverse researchers located in different areas of the world enriches our perspective, is aligned with our strategic mission to develop more inclusive collections. The geographic split from institutions who participated was quite noted. So almost 90% of those who participated were based in the UK and the US. I think the subject that we chose had quite a lot to do with that. So we heard from institutions, for example, in some parts of Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe or in Australia, who said, we like the approach, but actually African studies just isn't sufficiently important in our institution for us to take part in this. I think we also really found that the readiness of institutions to take part in these models varied substantially. So clearly some made very, very quick decisions. Clearly they had established criteria. They knew what they were looking for. They were able to set up our model against those criteria and see if it met them. And I think often in those cases, the acquisitions teams and the open access teams were working in really close collaboration, and that was really helpful. In some cases, there was initial enthusiasm, but it took a long, long time to work its way through internal approval, because it was this sort of slightly left field thing where you were paying for content, but you were also paying for something else. And, and some of those did, several of those did end up signing up, but it took a long time. And then there were others who were enthusiastic, but then actually didn't get it through the approvals process. So institutions at really different stages of engagement. Consortia were definitely important. So California Digital Library signed up last year. Lyricids in the US had another 13 institutions sign up via them. And then all the UK institutions, it probably won't surprise those of you who are involved with it, signed up via JISC. What about Bloomsbury? We definitely found it challenging not knowing whether or not the books would publish OA. It was hard to kind of put, we would usually tell library suppliers 6 months ahead of publication, here's a book, do you want to consider buying it for your library? Well, it was hard to do that without sort of saying, but it might go open access. And it meant that we had to hold off the digital editions from sale for quite a long time until we knew either way. And we didn't hit the 50% threshold until quite a lot later than we'd maybe thought. So these are things for us to think about internally, but just we want to make sure that books aren't ever disadvantaged by being included in this sort of model. I'd definitely say, we're already a mixed model publisher. So we have some books that are going open access and some books that aren't. And then I think all book publishers are in a way mixed model publishers, because everyone's selling the print and then using a variety of different digital routes to make books available, but this one did add some complexity. And I think also, I always find most open access projects end up involving pretty much every team within the academic publishing group. So there's always that piece where if you're trying to kind of enact change and you're trying to communicate throughout your organization why something is important, then that involves people and culture, but it also involves quite a lot of low-level systemic or changes to systems and workflows. So you're operating at this sort of very high kind of, here's why this is a great thing to do, but also, and could we tweak this tiny thing in our bibliographic database so that we can make sure we can send the right information out externally, and so on. So these things, there's a lot of moving parts behind the scenes. What's happening next year? We are committing to this model. We didn't reach our full target, but we really think it has potential. We've actually expanded it for year 2. So we've offered a second collection in African studies and international development, and then we have additional collections in gender and sexuality and environment and climate change. We've tried to keep things within what is, I admit, kind of a complicated model. We've tried to keep things as simple as possible, so they all have 20 titles in them. It's the same price for each of them to participate. The new ones are interdisciplinary, so we're pulling titles from across our arts, humanities, and social sciences publishing. We're prioritizing authors based in the Global South, early career researchers, independent scholars, and other scholars who are otherwise underrepresented in our publishing, but we're also leaving open some space for books where there's just a really strong ethical argument for increasing access to that research. Each of them operates independently, so if you're an institution that's particularly interested in, say, environment and climate change, then you can sign up just to that one, or you could take part in all 3, and many institutions already have. And so that's running until the end of November, with these books due to publish next year. So as I've said, we're offering this now. We're trying to make 60 books open access in our second year, so that would be about 5% of what we publish. At this point, we really don't think it's feasible to offer this across all the monographs that we publish, because we just don't think externally quite apart from the uncertainty that it would cause for us, because we wouldn't know whether or not they'd go OA, we just don't think externally the kind of funding or the systems are ready. We've heard from quite a lot of libraries that rather than being funded from acquisitions budgets, this is actually coming from dedicated open access budgets. And that means that potentially all the publishers that are going out and trying to make these kinds of models work, which don't involve fees to authors, and which really fundamentally are aiming to flip library budgets to focus on OA, actually that's not happening. And instead we're all competing with each other, which isn't a great way to make these models scale up. So I do have a question about what does it take to actually move that budget from purchase to OA models, and perhaps also, a lot of money is tied up in really big OA deals for STEM journals, which can be multi-year deals, and I think that can also limit the flexibility to support monograph initiatives. So I guess that's a very ongoing conversation, which existed before open access, but I guess it's just to point out that sort of similar challenges are now being replicated in the open access world. And I guess also, as I've pointed out, this is still a very new model, both for us and for libraries that we're working with. So I imagine there will be some iteration as we go through. I think that's all I really have to say, but just to say this is something that's in development. We really want to hear feedback. We want to hear thoughts about what might make it work better. How could it be improved? What do you want to see from us? This isn't the final sort of full stop in terms of this is how it's going to work, but rather a kind of foray into doing things differently. So I think I will end there and stop sharing, and we can move to the questions.
That's great. Thanks both. No, really interesting. And like you say, there's lots of stuff I'd like to sort of pick up on, hopefully now with the conversation. There are a couple of questions have come in, and just to reiterate to colleagues that are on the line to please do ask any questions, so I don't have to think of too many questions myself. But there is a basic question there that I think I can answer with your help, which is, like, as a basic question, is OA in perpetuity, or is it ever in any way time limited? I mean, we're talking about these, are they under some sort of open license, I guess? Is it CC BY generally, or? Creative Commons licensing? So the question is it OA in perpetuity? I think the answer is yes.
But I think OA is by definition in
Yeah,
perpetuity.
exactly.
If it's not in perpetuity, it's not open access. From our point of view, the licenses vary because we think it's really important that authors get to choose their licenses.
Yeah.
And especially as you shift into some humanities subjects, we know there are concerns about, say, licenses that allow derivative works.
Yeah.
So we do use the most restrictive license as standard, and that's partly out of an abundance of caution. But basically, if an author comes to us and says they want a different license, we will always permit it.
Well, that was my next question, actually, was because I was kind of assuming that is the ND license standard then the non-derivative, because there's quite interesting discussions around that in the humanities in terms of, obviously it's valuable to be able to do derivative works, but it can also be something that concerns people. I think that their work might be taken out of context, that kind of thing. So you said your standard license is quite restrictive, but people could have more liberal licenses if they wanted.
Yeah, so as standard, if authors are publishing OA with us, then we are using the CC by NC ND license. And while we do try to provide some education about licenses, I think it is quite a hard thing to get your head around, and we are a bit nervous about releasing, especially humanities content, under licenses that authors might not be fully aware of or comfortable with. But if an author says, no, I would like to have CC BY or whichever other license, then that will always be, we will always grant that. It's just, and I think it's also out of a sense that you can release something under a more restrictive license and later open it up more, but you can never take back the very unrestricted license. And I would also note that our OA books are signed under a non-exclusive license, so technically authors retain the full rights to their work, and if they want to release something under a different license later on, they always can. I know that not everyone will agree with this approach, but that's where we are for now.
It's an interesting discussion, though. I mean, we're always, I'm certainly no copyright or licensing expert, but it's something that we're very aware of can be confusing for people. I don't know if you have any thoughts, David, on what the licensing model is.
We do exactly we will follow exactly the same practices that Ros has announced. In the humanities, this sensibility exists, but we haven't seen a big scandal yet in our field. So whenever we see the first one, I think that people will start caring and we will have the first complicated discussions.
Yeah, just to mention actually that earlier on I was talking about a previous conversation we had with Martin E from the Open Library of the Humanities, and this same question came up then, and he did actually post a blog post sort of putting his perspectives over. So if I can dig that out, I'll post that later as well.
I will also say, in a different role, working at a publisher where we did use CC BY by default, at one point we found that some slightly sketchy third-party publisher was essentially selling high-priced print editions of those books on Amazon with no indication that they had originally been published elsewhere or that they were available open access. And I think that in a book context also made me a bit nervous, and certainly made our authors quite nervous. And unless you actually buy the book, you can't check whether they've cited it properly or kind of given the correct Creative Commons reference.
Well, there's an interesting follow-up there that we probably don't want to go too far down the AI rabbit hole, perhaps, but there, to what extent does the non-commercial component actually dissuade large language models? But there's been discussion around that. They've even been ignoring robot text, haven't they, and that kind of thing. So it's probably not a great deal, I'm guessing, Judy, if I'm saying your name correctly. But yeah, I think it's a brave new world of sort of based on good faith, isn't it? Whether or not people actually take any notice of these licenses.
Yeah, I think there'll be much more to be said about this. But in theory, I'm sure they've taken all kinds of open access content, but since very few things are even acknowledged, then in theory, CC BY should be a bit of not a kind of complete blocker, but in theory, if you're using any CC BY content, you should be acknowledging it. That's clearly not happening. So,
and obviously, it's the subject of legal challenge in the US, I think, isn't it? There's another question here for you, Ros, and as I say, please do post any more questions as we go.
I do have a question. To you and the audience, to the speakers in the audience, which is that I've taken part in a number of these debates, and usually my co-speakers have been library people and publishers, but we see very few academics involved in all these decisions. How are we to structure those collections? How are we gonna make decisions about publishing? What are gonna be our priorities regarding the type of books that we publish, and how do we justify these priorities to a wider audience? Because we're talking here about a model of scarce goods. I mean, we don't have unlimited budgets. We're gonna have to make hard decisions about what to publish. And I think that this should be a question of concern for everybody in our communities. But I only see librarians and publishers participating in these debates. So why is that? And do you think
well, that's a good question.
Do we have a conversation here?
Well, yeah, I don't know if there's any academic colleagues on the call who would like to comment on that, but it's certainly something that I recognise, if only in the context of, you know, we have our expertise in the library and we're trying to communicate, obviously, and advocate open access and open research and open monographs and licensing and all those issues. Everybody's busy and just trying to get...
No. This is the fault probably
it's about collaboration, isn't it, as well?
This is probably the fault of the academics that don't think this is a priority in their agendas. But then, I mean, you come to the outcome and you see the presentation of the collections that Ros has made, and then you start to wonder, so, I mean, how these decisions were made and who is choosing these books, and I mean, how do we justify this to the wider world? I'm not sure, Ros, whether you had any conversation on these at the...
So to the wider point, I would make I think publishers can justifiably have a role in curating what books are published. And just because you might be an academic expert in your particular area of your subject does not necessarily mean that you are best or better placed to make decisions about what should be published than a publisher who is deeply engaged with that subject, but is also trying to retain that breadth across a particular subject area, to see how it's developing, to be in touch with many academics over the course of their job as they seek reviews for jobs, as they go to conferences. So I don't think that necessarily being an academic and thinking about the kind of curation of books in that area are necessarily completely kind of aligned in terms of sort of skills and experience. And I do think that experienced publishers who've been working in those subject areas have a lot, and many publishers do work in the same subject area for many a year, do have a lot to bring to it. In terms of which books go open access, I mean, we've tried to be transparent about the decisions we've made. Which books are they? They are the books that are commissioned by our commissioning editor in African Studies and International Development, who aims to work closely with academics. We might have some series editors. We will have regular people that we're seeking advice from. I don't know that academics making those decisions sort of independently, or a small number of academics necessarily solves. I don't know if there's a problem there to be solved, and I'm not sure that you get to a hugely different result if academics are making those decisions. But
I just wonder if it relates to, because you made a point in your talk, David, that philosophy, for example, perhaps might not be a priority for these types of consortium models, simply because it's kind of niche, and there might not be the same sort of appetite to publish, say, books in philosophy. So I don't know if you want to sort of come back to...
No, I would rather disagree with Ros on both points, because you see, it is this, I mean, academic boards, interdisciplinary academic boards are making these sort of funding decisions at the international levels. Think of the ERC, and think of the National Science Foundation. I mean, academics have the skills to discuss where to prioritize, I mean, how to prioritize the investment and justify these priorities in the terms of the taxpayers' interests. I don't think that publishers should be doing that. I think that if anybody, I would be willing to consider librarians. But that's I mean, that's a conversation that at some point we would need to have, because it's, in the end, it's not about selling books or making a publisher prosper. It's about advancing knowledge.
Does it come back to...
That's what publishers, I mean, publishers want to, if you talk to any commissioning editor, they are absolutely driven by wishing to publish the best books in their area and help those subjects to develop.
Your shareholders don't. Your shareholders don't.
It's part of this discussion, perhaps one of the things that we were talking about, Ros and David, before we started the session, in terms of that issue around different cultures and book traditions in different countries, across Europe, for example, but also different disciplines. So I certainly don't know enough myself in terms of how the different disciplines within the humanities might vary in terms of their outlook. And I'm sure, Ros, as a publisher, you have an insight into that, and David, you'd have an insight from your own discipline. But is there something around that and the fact that it's not internationalized in the same way as journal publishing? It was, as I say, lots of conversation we had a little before we came online.
But I think it's internationalized in terms of the scholarly societies. I mean, the scholarly societies are international and they're having this discussion. But Ros was about to say something, I think, and there's a raised hand.
Oh, well, we've got an academic colleague with a hand up as well, actually. So perhaps come to you, Sam, if that's okay.
Hi there. I've been really enjoying that debate because I think it's a really interesting one about how much autonomy academics should have in deciding who gets published. And I do remember thinking when I got my PhD, it was like, okay, actually, the guy at Manchester University Press is going to decide whether I get a job or not. And that was kind of interesting to work out. I do think, though, Ros, that your Bloomsbury series is great, and I've lots of my PhD students who publish with you, and I'm hoping to approach you as well. So I think a lot depends on the attitude of the press. So I had people from Oxford here recently who really weren't interested in publishing anything that didn't sell very well and was ultimately aimed at undergraduates. And there is a kind of sense in which some presses are becoming more commercial presses, like the sort of Rutledge model, rather than the kind of model that you'd expect somewhere like Oxford to be following, which ought to be an academic one. One of the things that I think is a halfway house is a book series. And I think that's really important, because I asked the guy at Oxford about that, and he said, yeah, we don't find book series really work. They don't sell well. And we end up, closing these series down. And that, to me, is exactly where you should have a good relation between academics and publishers, because you have academics who are in charge of the book series in some ways and are working out, how to curate it alongside the publishers. So that might be a kind of compromise solution. The question I had there was about, if I'm approaching a press, like your press, I mean, I'm almost an African studies, but not quite, so I could squeeze in there. But there's other ways in which, if I'm opening it, you mentioned that you'll allow some books to go open access if they reach a threshold. So if you could give us any tips on that bargaining process, that would be really helpful, because it used to be something I did. Like, I would always say, okay, I'll go with you as long as you guarantee a paperback in 2 years that costs less than £30, because that's one way of ensuring access to people. Well, for us to starters, but also for people in less academically wealthy institutions. So could you say a little bit about, is that now part of the bargaining process? Should we all be saying, even if you can't publish me open access, what promises are you going to give me down the line?
So we're not, so there are other publishers who have experimented with a sort of model where they say, if it sells a particular number of copies or reaches a certain revenue target, then we will flip it to open access. Like CUP, I think is the most famous example of this. We will flip it to open access at some point after publication. That's not something we're kind of offering as standard. We do have a sort of model where we flip things afterwards, but to be honest, it's an absolute nightmare. And I don't know that I think it serves the books as well as it might, in that we will update the book to be open access. The author, I guess, can put it open access in their repository, but can we get all the third parties in the very, very complicated book selling and supply system to log that it's open access and make it open access? Maybe not. So we do want to focus on immediate open access in terms of where we're putting our energy and our time. It also takes us an enormous amount of time internally to kind of hand flip every book that, say, is closed access for a year and a half and then becomes OA afterwards. So it's something we will do if it's particularly important to an author. And for example, they couldn't fund a full upfront OA fee, but could fund a lower amount of fee. That's something we offer, but in all honesty, not a thing we're keen to do at great scale. And I think it also causes libraries some challenges, because maybe you buy something and then a year later it becomes open access, and that can cause some sort of friction too. But in terms of Bloomsbury Open Collections, and if you're working in one of those areas that is that we are offering the open collections, and we are expecting that for year 3 we will offer those same 3 collections again, then absolutely please approach your commissioning editor and say, I would like my book to be considered for this. We would encourage you to do that for sure. To your earlier point about the guy at Manchester University Press is going to decide whether I get a promotion. And I realize this is a bit of a sort of hackneyed debate and it's not that easy, but actually that goes back to academic systems of reward, which should be within the control of academics and the universities. It's academics and the universities who have somehow decided that it's the guy at Manchester University Press that decides whether you get a promotion, and that is something that could be changed in theory.
So one other thing one other point for discussion that I would want to raise here is that I predict that we will see in books what we have seen already in journals. So rock publishers like Frontiers, NPDI, etc., will come offering bargains, discount prices. I mean, massive publications models that will compete wildly with the established legacy publishers like Bloomsbury, Cambridge, Oxford. And I predict that if there is money to be made in these open access budgets, these publishers will emerge and will create all sorts of trouble. The only way to protect us from this trouble is to establish the credibility of its imprint on purely academic basis. And for this, you need to trust scholarly societies, academic boards. I mean, that's why I think that we will have a problem in debating the future of Diamond open access books if we don't make academic parts of the conversation, because if we make it purely commercial, in the end, there will be competitors that will spoil with their bargains, whatever model we come up with here.
Can I just ask a question around that perhaps goes back to some of what Sam was saying, and just my naive non-academic perspective that comes to me as a representative of the library in this context sometimes is the royalty question, and the fact that, well, actually now you're paying, say, £8,000 to publish a book. And if we don't have a sustainable model of Diamond open access, how important, Sam, say, is the potential royalties that you get from traditional publishing? Is that something that people are still concerned about in relation to the move towards open access monographs?
That was addressed to me, was it? Sorry.
Yeah, I just wondered as an academic if or
Sure.
Your perspectives from Ros. And
I wish it was important, but I think for actual proper monographs, royalties are fairly negligible. If I publish a student-orientated book, I know a colleague of mine, makes quite a lot of money from an introduction to post-colonial studies kind of type book. But I don't think we make much money. I think editions, edited editions of things make money, but anything that's only bought by academics and libraries doesn't seem to make a lot of money. The problem that I've had when I was thinking of going open access with the University of Leuven was people said, oh, but isn't that kind of like vanity publishing? Now that you've got to find this £6,000 to £9,000. I mean, at some point I thought to myself, well, you know what? Maybe that's worth it to me to actually pay that out of my own pocket, so that I then get a publication that I can send to, everybody through my different networks and actually ensure a readership. Because that's, I think, the most important question for us is so much of what we do fails to get a readership. There's so much is locked down, so much is inaccessible. Even at Leeds, we don't have the kind of access, for instance, that most American universities do to journals. So it made a lot of sense to me to actually, well, maybe, in terms of an investment in my career, £9,000 just paying that personally is actually maybe worth it if it then, allows my work to get more circulated. But at the same time, that then produces this question of vanity publishing and inequality.
I'm just conscious of time, and there was one question that I'd also was going to ask you, Ros, in terms of, because you mentioned that you say only, but you hit 50% of the funding target, and there was a question just how many institutions participated in the pilot. And
60
60.
institutions. So we'd set the fees. So to be completely transparent, the target amount we needed for each book was £8,000. So that's parallel to our OA fee, because that is what we need for it to be sustainable. But we've broken it down into, I think, a £1,400 participation fee for individual libraries. So you can think about that as £70 per book for the 20 books in the collection. Sorry, I've talked. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, and well, the follow on to that as well is, how do you anticipate using the pilot outcomes to persuade more to participate? But you've already indicated as well. I mean, certainly it's been through the process here at Leeds, and we have a budget, as you say, separate to acquisitions. I'm not that involved with that side of things in order to pay that to, in this case, Bloomsbury. So do you have any plans to sort of, I suppose it's partly down to the sector and where that goes, is it, in terms of?
I think we need to keep having these conversations, and I think, you know, libraries need to sort of think about priorities, maybe collaborate on how they decide which of these sorts of projects they might want to fund. But to some extent, the power is with libraries at this point, because what you decide to contribute to will be what we are ultimately able to do as publishers. So I think the ball is very much in libraries' court to try and support these sorts of initiatives so that we can offer more of them.
Yeah. There is just one more question coming. I will have to draw this to a close, not least because I'm supposed to be somewhere else at 2 o'clock. But any thoughts on the future for green open access books in university repositories over traditional publishing routes? Do you think that will expand at all? You know, Claire touched on that earlier. Claire's not here any longer, but in terms of, there are some provisions made for green open access in repositories, but I'm not sure if that's
I can answer a bit to that, in the sense that I'm a member of the Fieldside Archive, philosophy repository, in which we have an open access book section. And the problem here is whether what sort of supervision you want to have on these books. Because for repositories people, keeping an eye on the papers that get posted there is relatively quick and easy. With books, that's much more complicated. So it all depends very much on the resources of each repository to, supervise this process and avoid crap being posted. If that's going to count for funding bodies' mandates like the UKRI.
Yeah.
It's a matter of resources, really.
No, and as Ros says, there's obviously a lot more to talk about, and I've certainly got a lot of food for thought through that. And just to highlight, if you haven't seen Sam K. Petherbridge, who's a colleague from the White Rose University Press, has emphasised that point about the importance of the editorial and commissioning process for an open press. And Kate does represent the White Rose University Press in terms of mitigating against vanity publishing.
Thank you.
Lots of food for thought, but we have just past 2 o'clock. So unless anybody has anything burning to say, I think perhaps we'll bring it to a
Thanks,
close. And
Ros, Nick, and Claire for organizing these. That's what I want to say.
Everybody
for attending.
Yeah, no, thanks for everybody for coming, and thanks for the questions. And please do get back in touch. You know, anybody on the call who wants to discuss further, and whether at Leeds or elsewhere. And hopefully we can move forwards with some sort of more sustainable route to open access in the humanities. So thank you very much. Thanks everybody. You again.
We'll find a way.
I won't just close it down immediately. I always find if you're in a room together, you don't just sort of walk out the door and slam the door, do you? But no, thanks for that. That was quite an interesting discussion. It's
you're still recording.
Yeah, it's okay. I can cut that up. I'll stop the recording.